Good morning and a warm welcome to our Beyond Recruitment COVID-19 economic webinar. By way of introduction, my name is Liza Viz, CEO of Beyond Recruitment. Over the last 5 weeks, we have all lived through unprecedented times caused by one of the biggest pandemics in modern history. The virus has and will continue to have a profound impact on our professional and personal lives. As we enter alert level 3, we all want to know what are the consequences and what happens now. To quote Jacinda Ardern, we are not out of the woods yet. Thank you for joining myself and the Beyond Recruitment team as we host Shamubeel Eaqub, our guest speaker. Shamubeel is known to many of you. Shamubeel is a very well-known New Zealand senior economist providing economic consulting to senior leaders across the public and the private sectors in New Zealand and to businesses internationally through Sense Partners. Shamubeel is a regular, high-profile commentator in media, recently providing extensive insights on a fast-changing economy during the evolving and changing phases of COVID-19. This morning, Shamubeel will be sharing real-time insights with us on what the impact of COVID-19 means for business, employees, and employment in the days to come. Shamubeel will talk to the cost of the economic lockdown, what we need to plan for, and what the new normal looks like in different scenarios. A few housekeeping things to note. The webinar will finish at approximately 12 noon. We will leave about 10 minutes prior to this finish time for questions. You do have the opportunity to send your questions throughout the session and on this link. There is a Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be collating these questions throughout the presentation, and I will present some of the key themes of your combined questions to Shamubeel at the end of his presentation. We do have a very large audience, and we won't be able to answer all your questions. I would now like to hand over to Shamubeel. Enjoy.
Kia ora, everybody. Look, it's great to be here with you all this morning. I wanted to speak to you today about what life with COVID-19 will feel like from an economic perspective. I can't give you the health perspective, but I think what we've seen over the course of the last few weeks is there's been a lot of cliches that have been going around and everybody's making big predictions. And I think it's all a bunch of hooey, really, because we have no idea. This is an unprecedented event. So really what I want to take you through today is how I'm thinking about the issue, what sort of things you might look at, and how you might frame the current phase and the coming months and years that are going to be coming through. So I think the first point first, none of us have experience in understanding what's going on with the economy right now. This is once in a lifetime, once in many generations event. I'd consider it probably the biggest economic event since the Great Depression. Not because it's going to be the same, but because of the magnitude, because of the uncertainty, and because of the response that's required. It's also important to understand when things are happening like this, which is a very non-linear kind of event, things are compressed into timeframes that we never thought imaginable. In those periods, usual ways of doing things, whether it's orthodox policies when it comes to government or central bank, or what you and I do in our own businesses, is not going to work. We're going to have to dig deep, be creative, and think about new ways of doing things. I'm thinking about this in 3 stages of the economy. We've just come out of the first stage, I guess, which is the lockdown. Then there is a long extended period, which is the purgatory. Until there is a vaccine and until there is an effective treatment, it's not clear to me that the world is going to go back to the kind of normal that we've been used to. And during that time, we're going to see a deep recession. We're going to see all those things that we know is likely to happen. But there will also be structural changes that will come once we come out of the recovery. Let's give it 12 to 18 months, but when the new recovery comes, when the new normal comes, it is going to look different. We don't know how much, we don't know exactly how, but we can be confident that it won't be the same as where we started from. When we get these big shocks, it changes people's behavior. And it's the behavior change that is impossible to predict, hard to predict, but that is what sticks in terms of what it means for you as business folk. In this environment, I would urge you not to forecast too much. The reason for that is you cannot possibly predict outside of the heuristics, the rules of thumbs that we normally use. It's much better if we wargame, take lots of scenarios and see what you do in each of the situations, because then at least your mental processes are prepared and you are prepared for the kinds of things that might happen. And really, it's important that we observe what's happening to our business, our customers, and our competitors in as much real time as possible, because that's what will give you the responsiveness to be able to pivot to whatever the scenario that you had imagined. And the reality is the realities will shift very, very quickly over the course of coming days, coming weeks, and coming months. When I spoke to the Epidemic Response Committee a few weeks ago, there was quite a lot of conversation around, well, what does the downturn look like? In a way, it doesn't matter because we know it's going to be really big. What matters is the response that we take. So certainly from a government perspective, the size of the stimulus, the speed of it is going to be really, really important. But regardless of how we think about it, if you look at the scenarios that the Treasury produced, for example, this will be the biggest recession in living memory. And if you look on the chart in front of you, you can see that pink shaded area is the range of forecasts or range of scenarios from the Treasury. We've got data going back to 1935, and not once have we seen the depth of the potential downturn we're likely to experience over the coming months. So it is very, very different. And what we don't know is how deep it's going to be, how long it's going to last, and how the recovery will shape up. So it's really important that instead of trying to use models and forecasts, which I think are useless, and people who are selling them to you are charlatans, you should be thinking about scenario planning. You should be thinking about what can you do to respond to the environment as and when it changes. Forecasts are not useful in this scenario just because no model can possibly predict what is happening. And the reason why I say it's a bit of a fool's errand is because all models and the way that we budget is based on our experience of history. So we look back through history and go, so what happened in the past? But what if you don't have data in your business, in your industry, or in your economy that goes back to a scenario that was similar to this? So when I look at, for example, when we last had this kind of economic shock, as you saw in the GDP chart, we've never had something like this before. Possibly during the Great Depression, when we don't have very good data for. But what we do know from work done by historians is that the unemployment rate in New Zealand was somewhere between 15 and 30%. To give you a sense of what it means, at about 10% unemployment rate, there are 300,000 New Zealanders who have lost their job. 300,000 New Zealanders. Normally in New Zealand, we measure unemployment in tens of thousands. In this particular downturn, we might be thinking about it in hundreds of thousands. This is a little bit busy, but this is how I'm shaping up my thinking. And so I just want to take you through it so you can follow my narrative as we go through the rest of the presentation. When we think about the economy, we think about it in terms of how much we spend across households and government, how much we invest, what we export, and what we import. And so how much we spend is quite a big part of the story, because that's about 60% of the economy. And we've already seen that households are spending a lot less, in part because we haven't been able to spend because shops have been closed. So spending has halved over the course of the last month. Over the next few days and weeks, we'll be very interested to see how much it recovers. Because also during this time, what we've seen is significant job losses that are matching what we had seen at the level of the peak of the GFC. And also a lot of people would have realized over the course of the last few weeks that a lot of money that we spend is actually not very necessary. And some of that might stick at least for a little while. What we've seen in places like Wuhan in China is that even after the lockdown ends, the level of spending, activity, people socializing might still be 10 to 20% lower than where we started from. So it is quite possible that this initial period after the lockdown is going to be very different. Government spending is also quite a big part of the economy, about 20%. Now, central government will continue to spend, but there's a real risk in your local community that local authorities really pull back. And the risk there is because they're really worried about a lot of their income slowing down, their ability to raise rates has diminished, and we might see them coming off in terms of their spending. I think that would be a really big risk, because it means that the government is working as a cyclical in reinforcement rather than a counter-cyclical force, which is what we want them to do. The thing that really shifts in a downturn is actually investment. So we might reduce our spending on discretionaries, luxuries, and those kinds of things. But when it comes to the investments, that's what goes really quickly. Imagine you're in your own business. If you think there is uncertainty in the outlook for your revenue, are you going to expand your capacity now? Probably not. And that's exactly what's happening in multiple businesses around New Zealand right now. We're seeing investment plans being shelved. So we might be investing more in technology, but investing in office space, new developments, new stuff, that stuff all comes back. And to give you a little bit of context, in the last crisis, investment fell by about 13%. And it's all well and good to say the government should step up to fill that void, but the reality is that government investment is relatively small. So to fill that void, government investment would have had to increase by something like 45% to offset the decline in private sector investment. So I don't think we can escape the fact that there is going to be quite a big downturn. And one of the big areas of the downturn is going to be around investment activity, whether it's in building and construction, or whether it's in purchasing new equipment and expanding our facilities and factories and those kinds of things. Then we turn to, I guess, the global economy. So the exports and imports, that trade channel, that's of course very important for us. So each of them make up about a third of our economy. And so when it comes to our exports, it's actually holding up relatively well right now, in part because there is still quite a lot of demand. There is a lot of shortages of food in places. People are hoarding food. So that plays into our hands relatively well. But what we saw during the GFC was when the global economy is in recession, our exports suffer as well. We get a bit of a buffer from falling prices and falling New Zealand dollar, but our exports are still very vulnerable to a global downturn. So what hinges what our export outlook hinges on is its strength of the global economy. And I'm watching what's happening in things like oil prices and those kinds of things, and you kind of go, actually, it's telling us a very strong story about global demand being a lot less than it was. And if that's the case, then we should be very cautious about the outlook for exports as well. During the GFC, we were really saved by China ramping up our exports of our exports, and that really saved us. Because if it wasn't for China, our economy would have had a much deeper recession. I'm not sure this time around we're going to have the same kind of buffer from China as we did last time. And this period is also a little bit unusual in that we don't normally see disruptions to our imports. So we might see changes in prices, we might see changes in the way that people, the terms of trade, but what we don't see is actual physical inability to get products. So right now, because of the rolling lockdowns and those kinds of things, what we're seeing is it's hard for us to source certain products. So our imports are becoming difficult to source in some commodities and some products. And this is quite an important channel for us because there are so many jobs in manufacturing, in wholesale, retail, you name it, across New Zealand, where we are probably more reliant on imports, and those supply shocks have large ripple effects right across the country. And on a jobs perspective, it's a bigger impact on New Zealand than exports, because exports tend to be quite focused on agriculture and primary sector and manufacturing, which are relatively self-contained and very productive. Whereas the importing stuff touches pretty much all parts of our lives. Go have a look at your pantry or look at your wardrobe. You'll find that most things in there are imported. So our import connections are very, very broad. And so that means that when we have these shocks of countries shutting down, borders going up, trade tariffs coming up, trade behavior changing, that has a really big impact on the potential of the economy. It'll be very different across industries and regions, but it's an area that we should all be mindful of. This is not just about PPE, it's about almost everything that we import from various parts of the world. So what does it mean for the economic outlook and jobs? Well, at last count, we had something like 2.7 million people employed in New Zealand. Well, it's a lot less than that now. and it's probably going to be a lot less over the coming months. So during the lockdown, we've already seen some job losses. This is the first wave of job losses. So these are businesses that knew that they had to right size for what was coming next. There is a second wave that I think is brewing right now, where we know that there will be some business failures post the lockdown. While the government has provided a lot of stimulus through wage subsidies, tax credits, and those kinds of things, the reality on the ground is many businesses will run out of cash. Conservatively, I think something like 6,000 businesses will not have the money to survive this lockdown. So we are going to see job losses and business failures in that second wave. And then there is the recession proper. There's the feedback loop of the job losses, reduced spending that works through the economy, and also the recession that we're seeing globally, which has an impact on us. So this is probably going to be defining us for all of 2020, and this will be a longer recession than we have experienced in the past. The final sort of dimension that I think about it in is typically what I tell people is during a recession, what we tend to see is number of business closures remains much the same. So the deaths of firms doesn't really change. What does change is the birth rate. So new businesses starting just crashes through the floor. We're not willing to start new things, take risk. But I think this recession will be different in that we're going to see a real spike in business failures just because of what's happening in terms of the lockdown, people running out of cash. But also I think we're going to see such a sudden change in people's behavior, in the way that they spend, the amount that they spend, that we are going to see quite a big impact on businesses over the coming weeks. So keep a close eye on your suppliers, your customers, keep a close eye on what's happening with insolvencies, because those are indicators that will give us a good feel for what's happening in the economy. That first phase, I think, this lockdown, so once we're out of level 3, I think then we can say we're kind of safely out of this lockdown phase. The reason why New Zealand had to have a lockdown is because our health system was very unprepared for a pandemic. So I know a lot of people are saying, why can't we do what Australia has done? Well, it's because even at much lower rates of infections, our hospital and health system would have been overwhelmed and our death rate would have been much higher. So I think there's a lack of context when people are talking about this stuff. Everybody's become an expert in infectious diseases overnight, right? The reality is none of us know this stuff very well. And the reality of our resourcing is very, very important, and context on why we had to go much harder than some other countries. And the reason is our health system was too unprepared for the scale of the pandemic that's coming through. These charts will give you a bit of a context in terms of what's been happening. So on the left-hand side is the number of new cases. You can see in the red line is New Zealand. And we kind of had that sort of big peak in the number of new cases early on in April, and it's been slowly trending down since then. But you can also see what happens in other markets, right? So you look at what's happened in the US, what's happened in Britain. It's pretty grim stuff. It's pretty grim stuff, especially when you look to the right-hand side. And there are two things I'd like to draw out for you. One is the green line, which is Singapore. Singapore has very high rates of infections, in part because they have very wide ranges of wide testing, so they can find all of the people who have it. But the death rate is very, very low. So they have the capacity in their health system, which is world-class, absolutely the tops in the world. They're able to look after their people. In contrast, look at what's happened at much lower rates of infections in places like the US and Great Britain, where the number of people who are dying per million are so much higher. And so when people say we should be opening up the economy and shouldn't we think about the trade-off? Well, here is the trade-off for you. At current rates of what's going on in Britain, we would have nearly 10,000 more New Zealanders who would have died. This is a big number. In any given year, we have 34,000 people who die in New Zealand. And that would mean we would see a 25% increase in the number of deaths in New Zealand. I know there's this talk that somehow, wouldn't it be better if we kind of just loosened up a bit and it would be okay? Well, what we don't want is multiple waves of reinfections and multiple waves of closures, and also a big spike in deaths. Because what happens when you see those big spikes in deaths and infections is people lose trust and confidence in our institutions, in our government, and those kinds of things. So while it seems esoteric to talk about this stuff, those are the very foundations of an economy. If we lose trust in our institutions, if we lose trust in our leaders, I can assure you the economic outlook is not going to be very strong long term. So there are some big trade-offs here, but the trade-offs might be about weakening the very foundations of how our society and economy works. Also, there's a really big risk of spreading the disease. So when we look at the kinds of work that we do, so it's the types of occupations that we're involved in, right? So roughly speaking, those jobs on the right-hand side in this chart, so about 60% of all jobs are high contact with others. So we've been through, something like 11,000 different occupations of New Zealanders and assigned scores for each of those occupations based on data from the US. And we can tell from that essentially about 60% of all jobs are high contact with other people. So when we're with proximity with other people, there's a really high risk that the disease will spread, and it's going to have a big impact in terms of the infection, and that means the potential for further lockdowns and further loss of confidence in the economy. And this is why I think we needed to move so hard into the lockdown that we have seen. Now, just because the lockdown has meant that lots of people haven't been classified as essential, so we haven't been able to go to our offices and do work as normal, I think we've seen a big change in the way that we work. Just like we're meeting today online, and it's been very easy to organize, very quick. We've got 1,000+ people in a room, and we're talking about stuff that we're all interested in. In the past, we would have waited for many months to produce a big event, whereas now we're using technology and other things. So the take-up of technology had been very, very low in the lead up to COVID. So only around 300,000 New Zealanders out of about 2.7 million people who work would occasionally work from home, occasionally or sometimes or all the time work from home. Whereas now we know that the number is much higher, but we don't know exactly how high that is. But we can see, for example, in internet traffic data on the right-hand side, you can see there since the lockdown, our internet consumption has gone up by 20%, and the data used for things like video conferencing has increased by something like 85%. So there's been a big shift in the number of people who are using technology and those kinds of things to really travel, to keep working and to keep engaging with other people. The reason I tell you this is because there'll be some sped up change that's happening during the period of this lockdown. A lot of people are finding creative ways to keep their businesses going. And this will have some positive impacts and some negative impacts. Most of the survey data that I've seen suggests that about half of people say I'm more productive working, and another half say I'm not productive. But the majority of people say I'd like to work at least one day a week from home in the future. So this is going to be part of quite a big change in the way that we work, the demand that we might have for office space, and all those bits and pieces. So what we've seen is, for example, in level 3, we still haven't seen a big increase in traffic volumes. So I'm tracking this on a daily basis, and essentially what we're seeing is traffic volumes are creeping up in level 3, but we are still well below the level that we were before the lockdown started. Now, during the lockdown, we've been in a deep freeze. So you can see on these charts, again, we're looking at the economy on a daily basis because things are moving so rapidly. You've got to get a really good, clear idea of where the economy is at, where your industry is at, where your region's at, because these things are very different across different parts of New Zealand. But essentially, you can see on the left-hand side, businesses have been very, very reluctant to do stuff. So it's not surprising because the outlook is so uncertain. So when we look at things like number of new job listings, they've been very, very low, running at somewhere around the sort of 70% of the pre-COVID average. And you look on the right-hand side, we've all been doing the right thing. We've been staying home. We're not out there driving. Traffic volumes are down roughly 75%. And that's because we know that up to around 25% of people are essential workers. So it kind of adds up in terms of how many people are driving because they're still going to work. So we're watching these kinds of data points very, very closely to get a sense of what does each level of alert mean for the economy and how many people keep working. But don't be fooled by these numbers because in the background, people are trading differently. We're going online more. We are working and buying things online. We're engaging in different ways, and our underlying ways of doing things in terms of consumption and things will also be changing. And the reason why I'm emphasizing the real-time data is because the stuff is moving so fast. It is truly out of any kind of conception I have of how fast an economy can move. Things that we normally measure in months and years are happening in weeks and days. And one of the ones that I'm watching very closely is MSD is publishing weekly data on jobless benefits, job seeker benefits. And in the last 4 weeks to the 17th of April, the increase has been like a straight line. It's a rocket ship that's going up. And the current level is already just a smidgen higher than where we were during the GFC. We've lost as many jobs in 4 weeks as we had in the worst period of the GFC. And we've still got those second and third wave that I talked about before of the business failures and the recession proper still to come. So observe what's happening in real time, because our predictions are probably going to be wrong. But what's important is we get a sense of what is really happening, so then you can keep pace with the economy, and also you can right size your business for the right kinds of things. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll be moving into what I call the purgatory. And I call it the purgatory because we're waiting, right? We're just waiting for the vaccine to come through. Until that comes, we're not going to get back to the kind of normalcy that we've been used to. And, who knows how long it's going to take. Current estimates are somewhere between 12 and 18 months. So this is not about whether or not we want the economy to open up. The question is whether or not the virus is still out there, and the waves of infections and waves of economic and the cost to lives will be coming again over the coming years. So as we move into this purgatory, the first thing we're probably waiting for now is SME survival. So right through this pandemic, I've been working on this COVID thing pretty much since late February, because that's when it was very clear to me that the proverbial is going to hit the fan. This is going to be bigger than anything we have experienced. And as I've looked deeper and deeper, what I've realized is that not everybody is well prepared. Not everybody has the resilience to go through what we're likely to experience. So I think existential is probably the word you want to use. For a lot of businesses, this is an existential crisis. They may not survive this coming period. And not everybody is well prepared. So, across a whole bunch of different dimensions, what we find is, there's a whole bunch of vulnerability in different parts of the economy because they have low margins or they have high debt or whatever it might be. And you can see in this chart, it's quite busy, but it's not even. There are different industries and different businesses that might be at risk. And quite surprisingly, a lot of the risk is concentrated in that kind of mid-sized businesses. Those very small businesses and those mid-sized businesses tend to be very much at risk. Sometimes the small businesses are understandable, right? Because they don't have many customers, they're running very thin businesses, and so a shock can tip them over very quickly. And then if you look at the kind of that 10 to 100, those businesses quite often are kind of not big enough to have the benefits of scale, but they have all the cost structures of a big business. And that means that can have quite a big impact in terms of their ability to go through a period where revenues are very low. Certainly during the lockdown, for a lot of businesses, revenues might be zero. That can be a very, very challenging time. Now, I touched on this before, but again, this is really to dispel our tendency to rely on what's happened in history, those rules of thumbs that we use to understand what might happen. We look at history to understand what happened and ask ourselves, is this going to be different? A typical recession is not what many people fear, right? It's not a bonfire of businesses and jobs that people think about. What tends to happen is we run out of new hiring, we run out of growth, we run out of risk taking. So new businesses don't start, but you can see on the left-hand side in the black line, the number of businesses dying doesn't increase a lot during the recession, but it's already been increasing in the lead up to it. And it's really the lack of new things, new businesses starting, new investments. That's really where the big problem is. I think this recession is different in that many businesses may fail at the same time, whether it's about a particular industry like tourism, for example. Tourism and air travel related industry is going to be hit really hard. Air traffic volumes are down 95%. Passenger numbers are back down to almost zero. This is going to be very, very challenging for some regions, some industries. And we've got all the shock of the lack of revenue through the lockdown. And I think the support for SMEs in particular has been lacking, hasn't been big enough, hasn't been generous enough, hasn't been fast enough. And so I fear that there will be this wave of business failures that we're gonna see, and that has a cascading effect, right? Because each business also supports a whole bunch of other businesses. Like you and I trade with each other, everybody has customers and everybody has suppliers. So we're probably going to see that kind of knock-on effect rippling through the economy over coming weeks and months. And that's that non-linear part of an economy that we don't normally see, is when something closes and at the same time we see that lack of demand, we can see this escalating non-linear kind of event take place. And I keep saying non-linear because our brains are designed to think in linear fashion, and yet what we're living through is a non-linear time. So everything is being measured in exponentials, and that's very hard for us to grasp. So just be very mindful that the trends that you're seeing now may not be easily extrapolated. You need to think very carefully about what is it that you're seeing and what might happen in a month's time or a week's time or a year's time. They may be very, very different things. So just be very mindful in terms of keeping a really close eye on your suppliers and your customers, because the big risk is really the next 3 months when we're going to see that waves of business closures take place. And during this purgatory, really the big thing that tends to happen is, like I said before, we become very cautious. So that's what a recession is, right? In a recession, we sit on our hands, we become very careful, and that has a really big impact in the way that the economy functions. Because if we're not spending money, that merry-go-round of me paying you and you paying me doesn't quite happen. And so consumption is going to be one part. So, just our behavior in terms of spending, because if we don't have jobs, we're not going to spend. If we are cautious, we're not going to spend. If our incomes have dropped, we're not going to spend. But those are all the things that are happening in the economy right now. So for about 45% of the economy, we know that things will come back. They won't come back by a huge amount, but they'll come back by some amount. The thing that tends to come up a lot is investments. So if your business is exposed to construction, not infrastructure, because that's where government is very heavily dominated, but if you're exposed to construction, services, supplies, then you just want to be really careful, because this is when people pull big projects. Because if you're fearful and you're uncertain of the outlook, you don't commit to big amounts of expenditure. So if you look back through the history and that pink line on the left-hand chart, you can see that there's some big waves of investments that come and go, and the drops can be pretty big. The things that tend to fall off quite a lot is that discretionary stuff, marginal stuff. So think about you're in Queenstown. Are you going to be investing in new investments right now? Probably not. Will you invest in new investments in Auckland? Maybe, if the investment case is right and is in those more protected parts, like social housing or rental property or whatever it might be. There might be specific parts of the market that are strong enough and you're able to secure land and resources like construction costs at construction services at reasonable cost. But the reason I talk about this investment shock is this is where the big kind of impact comes, because it tends to be very labor intensive. For every $1 million that's spent in the construction industry, it has many jobs related to it compared to retail. So there's a multiplier effect that goes through the economy, where when the investment market slows, we tend to see quite a big effect on jobs and the economy in total. And this is also the bit that's most flexible and most volatile. And I don't think the government is going to be able to step up sufficiently to be able to offset the decline that we will see in the private sector. So I know lots of people are saying, well, what does the recovery look like and all that kind of stuff? And I'm saying, be patient. There's a recession that we have to work through first before we can have the recovery. I don't think it's possible for us to avoid it altogether. Within this, I would like to see a lot more investment, particularly from central government. And you can see on the right-hand side that in the 1970s and 80s, the think big stuff really meant that we were investing a lot through central government. So the capacity and potential is absolutely there for them to increase spending. The question is, will they also get support from the likes of local government? In some parts of local government, they can do that. In others, it's going to be much harder. And that's because a lot of local governments are up to their ceilings in terms of debt. And more often than not, the ones that are up to their ceilings are the ones that are experiencing the biggest growth and have the biggest need for new infrastructure and new expansion of capacity. So, we're going to have to do some really big reforms really quickly to be able to unleash all the kind of stimulus, all the support that the economy can possibly get, but also provide a good outcome. Because while the private sector retrenches, this is really the time we want the government to step in, spend a heck of a lot of money, but on things that are actually going to make New Zealand better in the future. So you look back 100 years, the dams that we have in the Waitakere Ranges in Auckland, those were built 100 years ago, and they had planned 100 years out. So 100 years of capacity they built in. That's the kind of future thinking that we need to take now, because there will be lots of resource, lots of capacity in industries, in jobs, people who will be gainfully employed to deliver the right kinds of things that will make a real difference to New Zealand going forward. Now, the next bit that we get into, of course, is the recession proper. Now, during this period of the purgatory, I fully expect that our borders will remain very restricted. So we might see some easing with countries like Australia or others who have got their infection rates under control, and there will be things like pandemic passports and whatever. But for New Zealand, that's going to be quite a big deal. So because our biggest source of visitors is Australia, opening up Australia will have a big impact for our economy, but also because so many Kiwis live there and that human connection is going to be very, very important. But for the rest of the world, I cannot see us opening up our borders anytime soon. And also, I don't think the aviation industry is going to be back to where it was, right? Almost all airlines are being bailed out by their governments, and they'll be shells of their former selves. There'll be tiny little operations compared to what we had. I fully expect air travel will become a true luxury as it was in the beginning, because these operations are going to be small, they're going to be expensive, and people are not going to do it nearly as much as we used to. So these border restrictions, the risks in the aviation industry together mean that economy that we had built up around international tourism, which directly contributed about 3% of our economy, and in total probably about 5%, that's probably going to go to zero. And that is really going to hurt. But that's going to be offset by us, New Zealanders, traveling around New Zealand. So if we can get our infection rate under control and we can open up movement within New Zealand, then I think the impact on the tourism industry will be much smaller. The impact on the economy will be much smaller. But it is going to be big, right? We're choosing between a 25% decline or a 50% decline, not the survival of the sector. We're talking about many parts of the sector that just won't survive. One of the things that I didn't talk about before, but I think is worth talking about, is aviation also provides us with a really important supply chain link. So quite a lot of very high value and time sensitive products go out of New Zealand and come to New Zealand in the belly of planes. And because the number of flights has reduced so much, that channel to market is much reduced. So we are probably going to find it really difficult to get some of our products into markets, and we're going to have to think very creatively in terms of, if we are going to access these markets or to sell these products to global markets, we might have to do it very differently to what we've done in the past. Now, the global recession that's coming will affect exports. We just don't have a good sense of how big it's going to be. We know it's going to be big, but the forecast from the likes of the OECD, the IMF, the investment banks are changing by the day. And this means that it's very hard for us to get a handle on it. Right now, I feel relatively optimistic that there is still enough demand for our food products in particular that is going to be relatively insulated. But when the recession hits proper and there are job losses in the markets that we export to, we should expect that people will be cutting back on spending on things that are relatively expensive, that are considered premium, so that are quite often sold into restaurants and cafes, which people won't be frequenting as much. I talked a bit about supply chain disruptions. I think that remains really, really important. So as the global recession hits, we are going to see this kind of cascading effects, the knock-on effects from not being able to source certain products. And that means that we're probably going to see people, some businesses finding it very difficult to source product, and they might have to source it from other places or switch the way that they do business. I don't think it's going to lead to the kind of onshoring that a lot of people are talking about. People are saying, oh, this is going to be the renaissance of manufacturing in New Zealand. Well, I don't think so, because the cost of manufacturing in New Zealand is still very high. But I think it will change the way that we think about things like inventory management and our supply chains. And I think, I'm sure all of you are very sick of the word resilience, but we'll be planning a lot more resilience and redundancies into our systems than we had before. The things that are likely to help us is, in a way, we're probably going to see quite a lot more trade wars, a lot of hoarding going on in the next few weeks and months, just because people are fearful of running out of food. And that kind of plays into our hands in some ways, because we're still producing good quality, safe food products. And the demand for that remains very high. So I think from a food perspective and a food exporter perspective, it remains relatively resilient. It's really around the manufactured products, things like logs, which might be much more affected because they're much more aligned to the industrial activity of global demand. And the final thing that recessions, that's difficult to avoid in recessions, is that feedback loop of job losses. So because people lose jobs and they lose confidence, they reduce their spending, they become more cautious. That collective cautiousness is what really kind of stops things from happening. Everybody takes longer to make decisions. You don't hire as many people, you don't make investments, the consumers don't spend, you see no spending, so you don't hire, and it becomes this self-fulfilling thing until there's a break. So something needs to be a catalyst to kind of break us out of this funk. And the question is, what will it be? Historically, it's been central banks. This time around, it's likely that it's going to be much more about central government, because the Reserve Bank has essentially run out of ammo. And whether you look at it in New Zealand or around the world, central banks and governments are just unleashing stimulus in ways that we haven't seen before. So the IMF, for example, is tracking every single country's response. And I check that out very regularly. And essentially, every time I go in, there is this new program. There's here's $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, right? We're talking about the number of zeros that are unimaginable. So, and this has just begun. We're 2 months into this thing. And already the response has been bigger than anything we've seen before. And we've still got many weeks and months of this to come through. And I think for us, we know that the central bank is acting. So the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has moved pretty quick. They've cut interest rates to practically zero. They're considering whether they can move to negative rates if necessary. They're looking at money printing. They're looking at liquidity functions. They're doing everything that they can. And that's exactly as it should be, because the crisis is so big, we must have all hands to the pump. And on the right-hand side, I guess, is government. So I couldn't find a good picture of the beehive, so it's a proper beehive rather than the beehive building. But essentially, if you look at what's happening with our government and governments around the world, they're just unleashing stimulus like there is no tomorrow. When the New Zealand government started, our response was one of the biggest on record. But in subsequent days and weeks, other governments have announced more packages and more assistance, because the reality of the downturn has become more apparent. And I think what we're seeing is other countries are doing a lot more, a lot faster, and a lot better than what we're doing. We should be looking around the world and getting the best ideas, because there are no right answers. It's about making sure you have the right answers for the reality of what you see currently. So we are going to see, I think, a lot more work. This budget in May is going to announce a whole bunch of new things, but this is just going to be a rolling wall. The government is going to be more involved in our lives and in our economy than it has been since the war era. So this will be something completely foreign for all of us. So right now, the big sort of focus in terms of the big dollops of cash is going to be about just preserving jobs and businesses. We're very soon going to come into the big increases in unemployment. I showed you before that the number of jobless now is already at the GFC levels. So they're going to see reduced tax revenues and increased expenditure on things like benefits and supports. And so, something like 30,000 people have lost their jobs in the last 4 weeks. And that's only going to, that's roughly half of what we had lost during the GFC. And we're going to see more support that the government has to roll out in the next few weeks and months just to kind of deal with the fallout of job losses and reduced incomes. And then there is still a big piece that's to come. That's the big dollops of injection, that catalyst, that the fire starter that we need to get this economy fired up again. Because what we're going to find in a recession is we kind of get stuck in this slightly depressed mood where everybody's waiting for somebody else to act. And in that time, it's very hard to kickstart the economy. But the government can, because the government can, unlike us as individuals and as businesses, they can borrow against an infinite future, right? Because the country lasts as long as it lasts, notwithstanding climate change. But it means that the government has a time horizon that is so much longer that they can take much bigger risks, much bigger injections, much bigger debts. And that's really where we're going to see the next big tranche of announcements. I think we've already seen the government saying that they're going to spend something like $54 billion. That's their kind of current capacity to borrow. And I think that's going to have to be increased quite a lot. I think we're going to see our debt doubling over the course of the next little while. And you can see this here. On the left-hand side is the amount of debt that New Zealand has. So this goes back to the 1970s. And the grey line, it's a little bit laughable now, but the grey line is what the forecast was in the half-yearly update in December. And the pink line is what I reckon is probably going to happen over the course of the next couple of years. And the only other times this has happened is essentially the 1980s, post the shocks, oil shocks, and the think big stuff. But also when you go back through history, when we had the war effort. So really, we are on a war footing when it comes to what the government is doing. This is the biggest government intervention that we have seen in peacetime. I'm not overly worried about it for a couple of reasons. And there's one relatively short-term answer for that, and that's because interest rates are currently so low. Because interest rates are low, even if our debt increases a lot, it's not going to limit our ability to spend in the future. But I think also the convention that central banks don't suppress interest rates, long-term interest rates, that they don't print money, that convention I think has been well and truly challenged. And what we're probably going to see is the central bank will remain very involved in money printing for many years to come to keep interest rates low. So while we talk about central bank independence and all that kind of stuff, the reality is to keep New Zealand sustainable, we have no option but for the Reserve Bank to remain committed to buying government bonds and keeping interest rates low for as long as we can see. There is an option for them to just, directly lend money to the government. I don't think it really matters. If we're not having to spend higher amounts of money for debt repayments, then our ability to spend, ability to stimulate, ability to look after our people remains pretty strong. And we're going to have to make some pretty big long-term decisions around taxes, around welfare, our safety nets, because the reality is that over the course of the next few weeks and months, we are going to find many hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders will for the first time find themselves in true poverty. And welfare in New Zealand puts you on the poverty line. The income drop for somebody who goes from employment to unemployment is somewhere in the order of 25% to 80%. So your ability to sustain your bills, your mortgage, your rent, your utility payments is absolutely gone. And so we're going to see a lot of people essentially looking at the welfare system and going, actually, it's not strong enough and it's not generous enough for us to be able to bounce back up. It will destroy my resilience, it will destroy my savings, and it's going to have a really big impact. So we are going to see, I think, a window of opportunity for some changes that will take place in coming weeks. Now we're quickly running out of time, and so I wanted to take you through a couple of different things. This is a quick game in terms of pre-COVID and post-COVID. Pre-COVID, we talked about full employment. Now we talk about mass unemployment. We talked about base rate thinking. Now we're thinking back to first principles. We were very physical. It's very digital now. We used to think about office for work. Now we think about office for connection and connecting with each other and those kinds of things. We talked a lot about traffic jams. Now we're talking about home and family and also how much space we need from each other. We talked a lot about last mile. It's the only mile because we're at home, so we don't have to go anywhere. We talked about globalization a lot. We're talking about decoupling a lot. We talked a lot about things like just-in-time and capitalism, Now we're talking about stockpiling and socialism. We talked a lot about private. All of a sudden, the government has to do everything. And we talked a lot about people who are highly paid and successful. And all of a sudden, we have newfound appreciation for nurses and supermarket shelf stackers, right? The people who are truly essentials to keep our lives going. The last 40 days have undone 40 years of our thinking. The way we think about government, the way we think about society, the way we think about each other is all changing. And the thing that hasn't changed, of course, is inequality, poverty, climate change, that kind of stuff. So what does it mean? Well, after this recession, there is a new normal. And during this sustained period of economic pain, I think we're going to learn lessons that will change quite a bit. I think right now, it's really an issue of, we know it's the private sector that will retrench because it's normal for us to be scared and not do as much. This is the time we really need government to step up. What does it mean for you? I think we need to prepare for really sped up change. Things that are going to happen in weeks and days that will completely change the behavior of our suppliers, of our staff, of our customers. Technology adoption is really, really fast, and it's going to stick. Quite a lot of it will stick. I think we're going to do things with fewer people because we're going to right size our businesses, and that's going to drive a ruthless drive for efficiency. We're going to see people traveling differently because, you know, that flight for a 1-hour meeting in Wellington, well, it was stupid back then, and it's just stupid right now. We're just not going to do that stuff. So we're going to see really change ways of doing things, and some of it's going to stick. And when we talk about onshoring, I don't think we're going to see factories coming back. I think we're going to see a lot more consolidation across vertical supply chains, and we're going to see a lot more people sort of, you know, keeping bigger inventories and those kinds of things. So what does it mean for you as business? Well, I think what it means is prepare for a 12-month to 18-month period where the environment is going to ask very big questions of us. And that question is existential. Will my business survive? And if it does, what do I have to do to make sure it does? We need to plan for a smaller pie. And in this environment, market share equals growth equals survival. So it is really, really important that you don't stop doing the things that actually get you market share and keeps you top of mind. What are the kinds of strategies that I'm advising for my clients? Well, the first thing I tell them is social license. Make sure that people still like you. Don't be a dick. It's really, really important. Do the front page test. Before you write to your customers or suppliers, just think, if that email was published in the front page of the Herald or the Dom Post, would people still buy your products the day after? And what I'm seeing from a lot of businesses is they're going on as if life is still the same, but it's not. You can't behave the way that we used to. Marketing is really important. Cut costs, but don't cut marketing, because the reality is if you can't keep market share, if you can't grow market share, if you're not top of mind, then you are really going to struggle to recover. Right size your business, absolutely, but make sure you retain and hire good people, because right now, more than ever, getting the right people in your organizations is so important, because we simply cannot afford to have the wrong people in our business. I'll finish up where I started. This is a once in 100-year event. Orthodox policy tools are not going to work. We're going to have to do new things. Some of it won't work, and it means we're going to have to change as evidence comes. There are 3 stages to the economy. We're still in the first one, which is the lockdown. There is still the purgatory and the recession proper that's to come, and there is a new normal that's coming on the other side. Our strategic vision should be to look out to that new normal on the other side, and we ask ourselves, how do we survive this and come through to this other side where we're going to be so much better? War game, war game, war game. Think about the worst possible scenarios and the best possible scenarios and ask yourself, how can my business thrive in those scenarios and in those environments? But the most important advice I can give you is get a real-time feel for what's going on and respond to that reality. Don't be hung up on forecasts and budgets, because they're useless. They're less than useless. They can be very, very harmful. Respond to reality, be responsive, be agile. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamubeel. That was very, very interesting, and I believe that you've probably answered so many questions just in terms of the presentation and the delivery of, introducing us to the consequences of the lockdown and what happens now. There are a number of questions that kind of cover the same topic. One of the key things that people are asking is, what insights do you have regarding the Trans-Tasman bubble, and what effects would this have on New Zealand business, on New Zealand tourism, on New Zealand imports and exports?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So essentially, the big benefit for us will be around Trans-Tasman tourism. In terms of exports and imports, those are still very strong, and there is no reason to think that that will change regardless of the bubble. So really the big thing is, I'd say it's probably in the order of 1% of GDP is the difference it would make. So it's helpful, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all.
Thank you, Shamubeel. The other question that many people are asking from our audience is what impact COVID-19 will have on the elections in 2020.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know. But certainly what we've seen is the polling has been very supportive of the government. And so, my view is that regardless of who's in power, our governments have proven themselves to be very responsive to crisis. So whether it was the Canterbury earthquakes or the Kaikoura quakes or the Christchurch shootings or the pandemic, our governments, regardless of stripe, political stripe, have responded with New Zealanders at their core and pulling out all the stops. So I don't think it really matters if there is a change of government or not. My suspicion is that given where the polling is now, that there will not be a change of government.
Thank you. The other question that people are really interested in is, we talk a lot about unemployment and the significant job losses that we're seeing primarily in the private sector. Do you have any idea as to what sort of a level unemployment is going to reach? There's a lot of talk around it reaching sort of 9%, 10%, and many people are saying it's going to go into the double digits and fairly high double digits.
Yeah, look, like I said before, I think forecasting is a fool's errand because we simply don't know. It really depends on how quickly the government can respond in terms of saving businesses. So we've already had, I think we're pretty much the kind of unemployment that we've seen during the GFC, right? If we have business failures, as I expect there will be, and we see tourism being, say, reduced in half, then we're probably talking another 200,000 people who are going to be out of jobs. So again, to give you context, normally we count unemployment in New Zealand in tens of thousands. In this downturn, we're going to count it in hundreds of thousands. I don't have a confident prediction because I simply can't predict how deep, how long this recession will be and what the recovery will look like. But certainly I'm very fearful that we're going to be looking at it in terms of hundreds of thousands and certainly in the north of 10% unemployment rate.
Thank you, Shamubeel. We've obviously seen unemployment hit the private sector. What are your views in terms of the public sector? Will that be impacted by this recession?
Look, the public sector will be impacted in the sense that they cannot seem to be unresponsive to the plight of New Zealanders. So even though we should see the government continue to spend and all this kinds of stuff, we would like to see them spending on things that support and grow private businesses. So what we've seen in previous recessions is that government hiring tends to stall through a downturn because their tax revenues are falling falling quite quickly, and so cost pressures become quite a big challenge. So I think if you think back to Wellington post the GFC, we had a 10-year period where nothing happened. That's the kind of scenario we should be planning for, because when you're under the kind of fiscal pressure that we already are in and are going to intensify, I cannot see the government splurging cash on civil servants in Wellington. I think what we'll see is lots of stimulus going into the private sector. So I know it feels like government is relatively insulated, and that is true, but I don't think we'll see the growth like we have seen in recent years, because the money will simply not be there.
Thank you. Another question that was popular was, where do you think the next growth lies in the future? Now, I know you said we need to be patient, we need for the recession to actually hit us, and that is so true, we're only entering this, but where will we see those green shoots?
Oh, look, it'll be everywhere. So unfortunately, this recession is going to be pretty indiscriminate because the economy is going to shrink. It's going to have ripple effects across many parts of the country. But we are going to see some parts that are going to grow really fast. I think, in areas like technology, areas like healthcare, in areas that help you work from home, areas that help you do a lot of that kind of stuff, is going to be pretty resilient through this period. The green shoots are going to come through areas that are very traditional. We're going to see big rebounds in construction and manufacturing and retail and hospitality, because those are the things we like to do. We like to spend money on ourselves. We like to spend money on fun stuff. And there is all the pent-up demand for the types of things that we haven't done. So I know there's this kind of feeling that we should have these brand new sectors and brand new things that will drive the recovery. Well, actually, it's the traditional stuff that are the bulk of the recovery that when it happens. And it will be because there is this pent-up demand from things that we haven't done for quite some time.
Last but not least, how will COVID-19 hit the housing industry?
Oh, I mean, I think those car parks that have that sit beside real estate agents are going to be very empty for many months to come. It's going to cause absolute devastation for the real estate sector. The reality is, if you've got unemployment that's going to rise to 10% plus, people won't be able to get loans to buy stuff. Banks are not going to be out there lending money. We didn't talk a lot about banking in my presentation, but right now what we're seeing around the world is banks are increasing provisions for bad debts quite quickly. When banks are increasing provisions for bad debts, they don't lend. Banks are fair with their friends. A housing market is linked entirely to credit. If you can't borrow money, you can't buy. If you can't buy, then house prices can't keep going up. So only people who can buy are the people who are going to be the bargain basement hunters. So I'm very pessimistic in terms of the outlook, and it's going to be quite regional. Coastal property, tourism areas are going to get hit really, really hard because those places suddenly have gone from being short of property to being really, really oversupplied. Even in places like Auckland, where the job losses are likely to hit the hardest, we're likely to see the usual trickle of Aucklanders leaving the region really escalating. So I think it's really important that we are very, very careful of not having to do stuff in the housing market if we don't have to right now. Be patient, because this is bigger than anything we have experienced. Don't think the experience of the 2000s is applicable to what we're going through right now.
Thank you, Shamubeel. You've certainly provided very good insights this morning and provided lots of different scenarios that we as business leaders can work through. In particular, as we work towards alert level 2, we know that working through the different scenarios will be imperative for business, for employment, and for those green shoots to arrive sooner rather than later. On behalf of Beyond Recruitment, I'd like to thank you all for joining us in this webinar. This webinar has been recorded and we will send you a copy. We also look forward to hosting more webinars with Shamubeel. Once again, thank you, Shamubeel. We appreciate your time.